Football at 4, John McMullen at JF McMullen. He joins us now on the Boardwalk Honda Hotline as we get a closer look at what happened yesterday. And as we always ask in this town, where there's a loss from the Philadelphia Eagles, John, who's to blame? But I think there's a lot of blame to go around. But when you look at the game plan overall, let's start there. Did you like the game plan that Doug Peterson came up with for New England?
It was okay. I don't think there was a lot of ways he could go with the lack of personnel and with the issues.
You have John. I don't hear John at all. Is there a reason why I don't hear John?
I can do a McMullen impression if you want.
Okay.
All right.
Well,
I can hear you guys.
Well, there we go. There we go.
Hey, John.
Thank God. You saved me from having to impersonate
I got
you, John.
There you go. You were just talking into the abyss.
Yeah, well, I feel that usually, but
Did you find any of Carson's passes there?
yeah, there's a little overreaction. Who would think after a loss to the best defense in the NFL? Carson did not play well, though. I think that's fair to say. But you talked about the game planning. I don't think there was a lot of ways they could go with the personnel issues and not having Alshon Jeffrey and Jordan Howard. I think they did the best they could with what they had from that perspective. When you got to grind it out, they had the one drive, and that was it. I mean, when you have to grind it out, you don't have explosive plays, you don't have a way to get those explosive plays, it makes it really, really difficult. And Bill Belichick always comes up with something. We knew Zach Ertz would be what he would be focused on mainly, and he put Gilmore on him for third downs, which was interesting. He took Miles Sanders out of the game, put a defensive back on him. And, the biggest issue I have with that perspective is think about how bad you are that Bill Belichick could think, hey, I'm going to take your rookie running back that occasionally makes a big play in the passing game. I'm going to take him out of the game because I don't have to worry about anything else. That tells you where the Philadelphia Eagles are offensively.
Today, Doug had mentioned that he was that he thought there was explosive plays out there. I mean, that's where I have to wonder, where does he think he's getting explosive plays from with the personnel he has?
Yeah, I have an issue if I want to assign blame, and there's plenty of it to go around. As I say, I think it starts with personnel. That's number one, and then I do think you can criticize the coaching staff for how they use the personnel, specifically at wide receiver. Jordan Matthews playing 85% of the snaps. Are you kidding me? 85% of the snaps. I'm even going to give Mac Hollins a little. Mac Hollins has to play before Jordan Matthews. He's been here. Forget about J.J. Arcega-Whiteside. And we talked about Jay Ajayi. He was dressed in case of emergency. What is wrong with this organization? That they offensively, I can't say it about Jim Schwartz. Jim says all the time, if you're part of this 53-man roster, I trust you. I'm going to play you. Perfect example yesterday, Rudy Ford's in there with Big Nickel. Yeah, you think he's comfortable with Rudy Ford? I know for a fact he'd rather have Andrew Sendejo, but that's the lot he's given, and he puts him out there, and he trusts him. And for the most part, he wasn't hurt by that. I think the defense certainly played well enough to win that football game. I think we can all agree with that. Offensively, they don't trust the young players. And you can't put Jordan Matthews out there for 85% of the snaps in Week 11 against the Super Bowl champions. That is ludicrous, and I don't know another adjective to describe it.
So, John, we know that there's really no help for the personnel in store other than, getting Jordan and Alshon back healthy, but they've certainly had those struggles even when those guys have played. And one thing we can't predict is the injuries that are going to then occur between their next game and the end of the season, and I think we can all rationally say there will be injuries. So if we're trying to get all the fans back off the ledge and everything, but inject reality, what's the best expectation for this team?
Well, I still think the best expectation is winning the NFC East because of the schedule, because of how they close, and I still think more likely than not Week 16 is going to be an NFC East championship game. So it comes down to, can they figure out a way to beat the Dallas Cowboys at home? Assuming Ezekiel Elliott is there, they have never been able to beat that team. But I do think because of the way the schedule is, they're going to have an opportunity to be in the playoffs and even have a home playoff game, because if you win the division, you're going to have a home playoff game, probably against a better team.
How would you handicap that percentage right now of the Eagles winning the division?
I would say it's 30%, which isn't bad.
No, but that goes to my point. The best thing we can do for the fan is say you've got a 30% chance of making the playoffs right now, and that's just the reality of the situation.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly not good from where most of us thought this team would be at the beginning of the season. I think most people, myself included, thought this would be a legitimate Super Bowl contender. So I don't think there's any question you've had to recalibrate things. They're not nearly as good as people had projected. I think most of it starts at wide receiver. It's been astonishing to watch what has happened at that particular position. And it's got more to do than just injuries. People constantly point to Deshaun Jackson. Look, that's a difficult injury, but every team in this league goes through difficult injuries. Alshon has had a career worst year when he has been out there. Nelson Aguilar, I don't even know what to say other than he's got to be benched. He's got to stop playing. Very similar to, ironically, he had that terrible game in Seattle. The Seahawks are coming in. Doug benched him for one game, let him sit back and think and get out of his head a little bit. But he's not helping this football team. And talked about Jordan Matthews, comes off the street and plays 85% of the snaps against the world champions. And then the young players. I've talked about it a lot. I've used that terminology a lot. Throw them in the deep end of the pool. It can't be worse. Eagles, for some reason, think it can be worse, and I don't understand it for the life of me.
Yeah, John, and that's why I agree with you. And I was going to ask you about Carson, but I'm really just getting sick of the excuses. And well, look at the weapons. They don't have any. Look at the injuries. The roster's depleted. Okay, all true. But at the end of the day, great organizations and great teams figure out ways to get wins and get things done and keep the train on the tracks. And at some point, you have to point out the lack of coaching for the wide receivers, and you have to point out Carson Wentz and his play. And I'm not crushing Carson at all, but we had a good conversation earlier about, is he great? Is he just good? It's so hard to assess this team from top to bottom, but you have to hold someone accountable.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's part of the job description as quarterback. I mean, you're going to take the hits when you don't play well. So Carson understands that. But I think he did not play well. I think that's the second game of the season you could say he played poorly. There were a lot of throws, mainly short and intermediate throws he's got to make. But then there's the windows. He had a tight window throw to Zach Ertz that down the seam that was ridiculous. The throw to Nelson Aguilar, he didn't track the football again. That was ridiculous. So you have some of those high moments, and you'd like to see more consistency. I think that's fair. As I said, especially in the short and intermediate throws that are there, you got to make. So I understand why people are upset about Carson Wentz, but again, it seems like every time after I talk about these losses, I got to go way down on the list before I get to Carson Wentz. I do. There's just bigger issues. And it starts with personnel, as I said, then offensive coaching, especially at one particular position. And by the way, that's not about Carson Walsh, because I don't think that's the issue. I think it's Doug Peterson and Mike Groh and their failure to understand they have to go in a different direction. So I got to talk about all those things before I get to the quarterback.
And I agree with you. He's not top of my list by any means, but great quarterbacks figure out ways to elevate players around them. And I know that's a cliche, and I know there's a reality of, players just not being good enough. But since that injury in 2017, John, I have not seen an elite quarterback behind center in Philadelphia. And he's good. He has flashes of absolute spectacularness. But we once felt like we had a guy that was top 1, 2, 3 in the league. And since that injury, I have not felt that way. And I know that there's factors surrounding that, feeling. But I don't think that can be ignored.
Well, I hear you. I mean, the one guy I always point to that has always elevated talent around him is Aaron Rodgers, and he just seems to make pedestrian receivers better. So if you do put everything in a vacuum, are there better quarterbacks? Certainly, there are better quarterbacks. But, I mean, you just saw maybe the greatest of all time. He didn't look very good without any weapons, without any offensive linemen. In fact, I constantly, from the other perspective, people say, well, the Eagles' defense has looked really good over the past 3 games, and it was Mitchell Trubisky, but Josh Allen, and now it's even though you have Tom Brady, they don't have an offensive line, they don't have weapons. I mean, the other team is playing, is I guess I'm getting to the point of, and that is one of the best defensive minds in football, taking away Zach Ertz on third downs, taking away the only explosive player this team has had, Miles Sanders. So that's part of it as well. But I hear you. I mean, there are certain quarterbacks that would make receivers look a little bit better. But, I mean, take a look at that back shoulder throw to Jordan Matthews. Can you make a better throw than that?
No, you can't.
As a receiver, got to come down with that football. I mean, Jordan, and I feel like I'm picking on him, but for good reason, more from the organization standpoint. He was targeted 6 times. He got separation like the fans in the seats. That's how much room he generated. And he's out there for 85% of the snaps. That's a coaching problem. Why is he out there? And it's an organizational problem as well. Why is he signed number 1 before you ask yourself, why is he out there? So you got to answer both of those questions before why isn't Carson Wentz throwing Jordan Matthews open? Well, he did on one occasion, and he did nothing with it.
John McMullen, Football at 4, at JF McMullen. I feel, John, that Wentz has a couple things going against him. One, the whole Foles thing that will just, never go away unless he wins the Super Bowl and is the MVP and has some special season that makes people forget that. But 2, he's almost falling into that Ben Simmons world where he's a great player, but it's like the fact that he can't make the easiest of easy. He can make the special play. He can scramble out. He can avoid the rush. He can duck under the sack. He can run. He can do all that, but it's I'm standing in the pocket. I have no pressure, and there's a guy there, and I just can't deliver it to you in stride so that, you know what I mean? Like, it feels like the most basic of things is where it's like similar to Simmons. The most basic thing is shooting the ball, and he can't do it, and it feels like Wentz is kind of going down that road where he can make all the highlight reel plays, but it's the basic play that he's missing.
Yeah, I hear you. I get the analogy. I don't necessarily agree with it because I don't think it's consistent with Carson. I don't think it's every game. I think for the most part he will make the ordinary throws that are there. I think it was a problem yesterday, and if it becomes consistent, I think then it becomes more of a valid comparison when you talk about Ben and his inability to shoot football. But I think you're also shoot the basketball. You're also right when you say that Carson, to me, is better with off-schedule stuff, and that's always a concern. But some of the greatest quarterbacks in this game, and I go back to Aaron Rodgers again, I mean, some of his brilliance is off-schedule. It's not about the offense. It's not about what was drawn up. So I don't know if that's necessarily a bad thing if you make the ordinary plays. And for the most part, I think he makes them. Yesterday he didn't. So I get why people are upset about it today, but I don't think that's been consistent. And if it becomes consistent, yeah, then you have an issue.
Right. Well, and it's like Simmons. There's 82 games, 20 of them, when he doesn't play well and he's not aggressive, it's, oh, man, he really stinks. He's got to go. You got to, But the other 60 that he is aggressive and plays really well, you kind of forget that he doesn't shoot the ball all that much.
Yeah, well, I guess the difference from my perspective would be that, like, Ben doesn't want to shoot. I mean, he just doesn't want to attempt it. It's not like Carson doesn't want to throw from the pocket, doesn't want to, wants to be off schedule all the time. He typically makes those throws, as most quarterbacks do. By the way, that's the disappointing part. Why maybe it's uncomfortableness with Lane Johnson leaving the game, but you can also criticize that and say, most quarterbacks don't have the best right tackle in football, and you got to persevere with lesser pass protection. So I think there's other ways you can criticize him. But certainly in that particular game, look, he didn't play well. But on the other side, the greatest quarterback of all time didn't play well. And no one's talking about it. They're talking about it in Boston. And I think Tom Brady's frustrated because he's not comfortable and he doesn't have weapons. And he's 42 years old, and people are finally saying, did Father Time finally catch up with him? Maybe he has. But the point I'm trying to make is if you don't have weapons and you don't have an offensive line and you don't have pass protection, even somebody like Tom Brady is not going to look good.
John, do you think the defense, which has played a lot better over the last 3 weeks, and now granted that some of that is against the Mitchell Trubisky's and Josh Allen's of the world, but is this defense to a point where it's starting to get good enough to be able to carry the team a little bit, or are we still kind of far from being able to say that?
Well, I think they have their own personnel issues on that side of the ball. I think we'll learn a lot more with Seattle when you have Russell Wilson playing at an MVP level and they have at least competent receivers who can hurt you.
Yeah.
They have a good running game. I do think we'll have a better indication of next week. The Eagles generally, though, play very well defensively at home. Where they have their issues is on the road against quarterbacks that can really throw the football. Mm-hmm. What we can say is Jalen Mills, Ronald Darby, Vontae Max, they calm things down on the back end. I'm kind of surprised Jim has been able to scheme up the linebackers without Nigel Bradham. There's not a lot of talent there.
I still think Camus, though, the way he's playing, I'm not quite sure that he's not the best linebacker that they have, because I don't think Nigel's just played all that well the last 2 years when healthy.
No, I don't think he's played well either. I think they need upgrade at all three positions, even with Nigel at 100%.
Absolutely.
From Jim's perspective, and I know from Ken Flagell's perspective, and I know people hate this, but they like Nate Gary. He's deficient in all the obvious areas. I think it's going to be interesting how they move forward when Nigel is back. Who's going to be that second linebacker in the nickel? And then they've cobbled it together. Fletcher Cox up front, I mean, that's a big part of it. He's finally playing like Fletcher Cox again. And I think that tick they made by going back to moving Brandon Graham inside has helped a lot in obvious pass rush situations. So it always starts up front with a Jim Schwartz defense, and it's gotten better when Fletcher's gotten back to his dominant self. So I think it starts there, and then everybody else has been competent. And I think, hey, if you're competent and you have a dominant front and you have somebody wrecking things from the minute the football is snapped, you got a chance.
John, obviously, the other thing from yesterday you mentioned briefly we talked about was Lane Johnson. And I think today Doug hinted that if Lane can't play, that Dillard would, in fact, be the guy who would be the starter. Is that what you took from that?
Yeah, I did. And that was another thing. I said that in game, and this is another indication of young players. And I get it. He's not practicing during the week, and you're more comfortable with Vaitai. He's versatile. But this is your first-round pick. Why isn't this plan B at some point during the first 10 weeks of the season that says, hey, should we maybe cross-train Andre Dillard a little bit to get him ready in case Lane Johnson gets banged up? I know nobody thinks about that because it's Jason Peters always going down. But, I mean, it's just the lack of foresight from this offensive coaching staff when it comes to young players. Not cross-training JJ, not cross-training Andre Dillard. And then all of a sudden you have to put lesser players into the game. And then you revisit it and say, we better get Dillard out there. We should have had Dillard out there yesterday, but they weren't prepared for it.
How much then of this 5-5 season that we've seen, because they pretty much had a shot to win almost every single game other than, the Dallas game, I guess, and they got Minnesota maybe. But everything else they've been in, it's been a play or two, and it's been this or that. How much do you kind of fault the preparation, the coaching staff for this team being 5-5?
Well, I fault it from a decision-making standpoint. It's always personnel. It's always personnel first and foremost. And, if Nelson Aguilar is a perfect example. If he catches 3 or 4 balls, that's two or three more wins. So if in other words, personnel can erase a lot of mistakes. But while I say that, you keep going to the same well. Like, whose fault is that? That Nelson's on the field in high volume situations, getting the football and failing again and again and again. Whose fault is that? Like, at some point, do you say, we made a mistake, we shouldn't have exercised the $9.4 million option? At what point do you say, let's go with somebody else for the mere fact of the matter? And by the way, it might not even be somebody here. Why is this organization not canvassing every single practice squad? They have practice squad receivers here. Why aren't they getting a chance? Why do you keep going? The old definition of insanity. Why do you keep going to the same well and expecting a different outcome? That's a question the coaching.
It was actually brought up to
answer.
Peterson today about why they are so insistent on bringing guys back who have ties to the organization. Matthews, Ajayi, all these guys who you have had connections with in the past, as opposed to maybe bringing in, somebody else.
Well, and that's why I have so much respect for Jim Schwartz. Whatever you give Jim Schwartz, he's going to use. He's going to cobble it together to try to get through a football game. The other side of this coaching staff has to have everything perfect. You have to understand the system. You can't be put out there. You can't be used. You think again, I use Rudy Ford because who is Rudy Ford? What has he done? Why is he out on the field? But Jim is using him to get through a football game. Doug Peterson, Mike Groh can't use a second-round pick. They've stopped now that Jordan Matthews is back. They've stopped using Matt Collins, who they say is graded out so well. And now they're bringing Jay Ajayi back. And again, Lane Johnson goes down. They won't put Andre Dillard in there. It's Halapula Vati. There's a lot of questions as far as trying to do things on the fly and trying to get through a football game. It's a Jim Schwartz strength. It's not a Doug Peterson or Mike Groh strength.
John McMullen at JF McMullen, who will be a part of the countdown to kickoff for tonight's Monday night game. Kansas City taking on the Chargers, and of course that's 6 to 8. Tony Bruno will be in the house, a standing up version. He will be standing the entire show. But Bruno's back tonight. McMullen, Colin Thompson, always good fodder, as I'm sure they'll have plenty more thoughts on this Eagles loss. Thanks, pal.
All right, thanks, guys.
John McMullen, like all guests, appear via the Boardwalk Honda Hotline.